Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Yeah.
Today we're meeting with Warren Larkin. Warren is a consultant clinical psychologist and he's the managing director of Warren Larkin Associates. Thanks for joining us today, Warren. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, Warren. Very nice to meet you. So, as I understand it, Warren, you left school with 2 O-levels. How did you end up becoming a clinical psychologist?
Well, actually, that's probably giving me too much credit. I left school with 1 O-level and 1 CSE in woodwork. So I got a CSE in woodwork and I got an O-level in religious studies. It was super useful, very, very helpful to me in my career. But I couldn't get a job. I couldn't get an apprenticeship. I couldn't get an interview I couldn't even get an interview for a job because I didn't have maths or English. My dad said to me, you need to go to sixth form college or to technical college and resit maths and English because you're never going to get a job otherwise. So I did that. I went to a sixth form and resat maths and English. And what I learned during that process was that when I was in a different environment, a calmer, safer, more predictable environment where the adults were encouraging and supportive as opposed to violent and threatening, I was able to learn. So I learned something about the fact that being stressed all the time in an educational setting is not good for your life chances. And it was just a very, very different environment. So I passed maths and English very quickly. And they said to me, why don't you do A-levels? And I was like, well, that's never been on the cards, because they told me I was stupid at school. I don't know if I should be even thinking about doing that. So I talked to my parents and they said, well, give it a go. And I did. I studied psychology and medieval history and religious studies and general studies. And I passed a couple of those, but I wanted to resit because I wanted better grades. And I went to Wigan Technical College and resat and ended up getting a place at the University of Hull. So it was most unexpected. And I studied psychology at the University of Hull. So, yeah, it was a bit of it wasn't what I expected. I expected I'd be working in the pit but all pits shut, so I couldn't do that. So ended up being a psychologist, which is, a different expectation.
But it's such a tangible, such a clear example of the importance of environment. Because if you think about clinical psychology, it's like you have to at least get a 2-1. There is a real heavy emphasis on academic ability in order to get on a training course. So the fact that you had this turnaround just because you're in a different environment speaks volumes, really.
Yeah, and I guess it's why I'm really interested in the application of trauma and resilience-informed approaches in education, because I left school with what were the ingredients for intractable imposter syndrome. That's basically what I came away from my secondary education with, as opposed to feeling full of hope and potential and confidence. Quite the opposite, actually. So I feel really strongly about applying this science to educational settings because I was at crossroads in life, and it was only by accident that I ended up in an environment that changed my life, really. So that school was very, very relational and very compassionate and very calm and orderly, and they were kind of doing all the right things. They had a relational culture, but at the same time that supported academic achievement. As opposed to a chaotic environment that was constantly, unpredictable, threatening. Teachers use shame and humiliation and violence at times to control students. Not surprisingly, your prefrontal cortex switches off because you're stressed and you're looking out for, signs of danger. And that is not going to be a good opportunity for learning for most students. And I think that's a lot less nowadays, but it's still for a lot of students, they spend significant amounts of time not feeling safe at school. In fact, we're doing a randomised control trial of 100 schools funded by the Youth Endowment Fund, and one of the things that we're finding is, I think it's like 36% of students in our insights work with schools say they don't feel safe at school. So it's still a problem, unfortunately.
Thanks, Warren. That's a really powerful description. As Naomi suggests, we've spoken to quite a number of people who describe a kind of similar sort of situation. I think mine was a bit similar, although I don't think I had the same excuses as you because I was fortunate enough to go to a grammar school, but I certainly felt imposter syndrome there.
Yeah, I think a lot of us do.
So you've ended up working predominantly with children and families. What was it that attracted you to this group?
Well, I guess later on in my career, I ended up as clinical director for children and family services in Lancashire. So that's kind of where I ended up. But at the beginning of my career, I worked with young people. I say young people kind of between the ages of teenage years and kind of 30s, because I worked in first episode for psychosis services. And that back then, the period of kind of 14 to 35 was the demographic that we aimed at. So that was kind of most of my clinical career. But before that, I worked in the asylums. My first two jobs were what they called resettlement teams, which were trying to help people who lived in asylums for 50 years move into the community, which was questionable ethically, but on the flip side, at least they closed the asylum. So I kind of saw early on that trauma was a really big part of the manifestation of people's in distress, and that psychosis and trauma were kind of two sides of the same coin. Psychosis was just a manifestation of trauma, really, as opposed to being this brain disease that was degenerative in nature, that was kind of, quite frequently the story that psychiatry told to people. I kind of ended up working with young people and their families because early intervention in psychosis is very much about trying to help people as early as possible. So that's kind of what I did for a lot of my clinical career. But then later on, when I was in the leadership role for the last 5 years, I kind of realised that whilst early intervention is fantastic, prevention is even better. So if we work with families and we work in the early years and we focus on prevention, we get better outcomes across the life course, but we also save money as well. So I'm very much an advocate of prevention and preventative approaches. And for the cases where we've not been able to do that, early intervention were possible. But these days, it seems to me that early intervention is extremely rare, apart from first episode psychosis, where it's kind of enshrined in legislation and it's funded properly. Beyond that, you're going to really struggle to find an example of early intervention in the NHS, apart from in cancer. But in terms of mental health, I think it's quite a rarity.
So roughly when was it you were working in those mental health services, Warren?
Well, around kind of 1998, I think I first started working in the NHS. That's when the original ACEs study came out, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So I remember it. I think I was working at Prestwich at the time. Worked in those resettlement teams in the long stay institutions for 2 years, and then I worked in Manchester for a couple of years with Tony Morrison when he was developing his theory and his trials around applying CBT to voices, which was really interesting. And then I went to do my clinical training, and after that I went to work back in Manchester with the people that I'd done my training placements with. And that service the service that I worked in was really set up to be a research trial to test CBT for psychosis and CBT for family work in psychosis. And then, that was before it was kind of mainstream, before it was, enshrined in NICE guidelines. So I was very lucky, actually. I got to work with people who were doing cutting edge work, at the frontiers of developing psychological therapies for people with more severe mental health issues. So, that's what I did. And then in 2006, we published this book here, which was about trauma and psychosis, and made the case for the relationship between traumatic experiences and the onset and maintenance of psychosis. And we proposed an integrative theory that said, if you're trying to make sense of psychosis, if you're trying to help people psychologically, here's a way of formulating that. And here are some ideas about how you can go about it. Because back then there wasn't, there was no manual to go to. There was no, treatment manual like Adrian Wells' book on anxiety. There was nothing like that. So we were kind of like trying to say, okay, here's an integrative theory. We published a paper on it. Here's some case examples. Here's what you can do. And then the rest of the book was lots of people working in that field, talking about the research and the clinical work that they were doing with people with trauma in the context of psychosis. There's a potted history.
Thank you. So what's the title of the book? Because some people will be listening to the audio and my eyes aren't good enough to see.
Good point. Yeah, you're a professional. You know what you're doing. Trauma and Psychosis, New Directions for Theory and Therapy, edited by Warren Larkin and Tony Morrison, and it was published by Routledge.
Thank you. So that was obviously a very important publication. You've also been involved in policy development and acting as an advisor to government. What did you pick up from that sort of work?
Yeah, so I kind of got involved with the Department of Health during the coalition government. I had this title of clinical lead for adverse childhood experiences. For kind of 18 months, 2 years, I worked with policy leaders in the Department of Health to think about how we might implement routine inquiry about childhood adversity in specialist services. So there were two kind of policy documents really that were published. One was the Future in Mind report, which was the output of the Children's Mental Health Task Force that Norman Lamb set up. So I was a part of that. And one of the promises that I kind of advocated for in that document was that we would introduce routine inquiry for specialist services like sexual health services, mental health services, early years services. And I was also involved in a group that was a kind of an expert reference group the government set up looking at child sexual exploitation around the time that all of that was kind of blowing up in Rotherham and Rochdale and other places. So there was a report presented to the Prime Minister called Tackling Child Sexual Exploitation. And in that document, there's another promise, which was we're going to introduce routine inquiry about childhood adversity into specialist services. So there were two very prominent policy promises, and I was trying to help make that come about and put into place the some of the infrastructure mechanisms. I was working with different teams to try and make that possible. So once it was introduced as a kind of requirement for the NHS and for sexual health services and other settings, they will be able to have some guidance, have some materials, and also know how to collect that data. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So we were on the cusp of that becoming a real thing that professionals had to do in the real world. We had an election and we got a new government, and I learned something about how it works. And how it works is you get a different government. They delete the spreadsheet that you're working on for 2 years, and suddenly it's not one of their commitments. So that work evaporated pretty much overnight, actually. So that was one experience. I also did some work with the Scottish government, again on routine inquiry. So they were looking at implementing routine inquiry in primary care. So we trained a lot of GPs, practices in what they call the deep end practices. So the kind of most challenged GP practices, with the most challenging demographic and, most need in their communities. So we work with, I think, a dozen deep end practices, training the GPs and practice nurses how to do routine inquiry about childhood adversity with clients. And it was going really well. And we had an evaluation lined up with one of the universities in Scotland. And then COVID happened and everybody dropped what they were doing and went and focused on COVID for 2 years. So the evaluation of that work never happened, was never published. So that was a shame. But I worked with Scottish government people and NHS Health Scotland for a couple of years on that. And I've also done some work in North Macedonia with UNICEF and the government in North Macedonia, again, looking at implementation of routine inquiry in primary care. Again, we didn't get the evaluation at the end for various reasons, mainly COVID. But yeah, I've kind of seen how it works. And I think if I had to sum it up, it's really about access and influence. I think it's about having access to right people, to decision makers, and being able to influence them and get them to care about the things that you care about. And my advice would be to do it quickly, because if a government changes, all of that can just disappear overnight. So it was a very interesting and world events as well, of course. World events can completely turn things around literally overnight. So it was an interesting insight into how policy is made and enacted, but also the fact that sometimes policy might be made, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change practice. Because in the care programme approach, which was the Department's health policy for secondary care for like over a decade, there was a stipulation that they should ask people, have you experienced physical, sexual or emotional abuse at any point in your life? That was part of the care programme approach assessment. And it's meant to happen every year. And we did an audit. We did a freedom of information study. Myself, Charlie Brooker, John Reed, Angela Kennedy, I think, were the authors. And we asked for that freedom of information and stuff back from 56 mental health trusts. I think 5 of them responded and said they had any kind of audit of practice. And only one of them said they could actually find that audit and they would send it to us. And that never arrived. So there's absolutely zero evidence that, even though it was policy to ask about abuse during mental health assessment, there's zero evidence that it actually happened or that staff got any training how to do it. So I also learned that just because it's policy doesn't mean it's going to change practice as well. So, yeah.
Sounds very frustrating, Warren. A lot of fascinating work, a lot of brilliant ideas produced, I think, but ultimately really difficult to clinch the deal.
Really difficult to clinch the deal. And having said that, I think the good news story is first episode psychosis. The service that I worked in was selected as a demonstration site for psychosis for IAPT, increasing access to psychological therapies in serious mental illness. And there were 6 sites, 2 for personality issues, 2 for psychosis, 2 for bipolar. We were one of the ones for psychosis. So we got extra funding and we were asked to basically demonstrate what's possible in the field of psychosis and show the other services what could be done. What does gold standard look like? So we did that, and we were evaluated by the Department of Health very closely. And the evidence that we collected alongside the other services that were these demonstration sites was used to justify the 2-week to referral treatment target that was brought in for first episode psychosis. So on the upside, we were involved in that piece of work, which did lead to policy change. It did lead to practice change, and it led to funding. I think it was a recurrent funding of £320 million a year. So even today, if you go to your GP with symptoms of suspected psychosis, you will be seen, assessed, and offered treatment within 2 weeks. So I think that's the only one I can think of where policy has followed evidence and influenced practice so kind of directly. So that is one good news story, I think.
Thank you.
But yeah, the rest of it's been horribly frustrating. So
Warren, a lot of that work you've been doing in your own consultancy, because you left the NHS in 2017, are there drawbacks or hurdles that you've encountered, do you think, because you've been doing work in private practice rather than under the remit of the NHS?
I think there's definitely pros and cons. First thing to say is I've never looked back. I think that, the work that I did in the NHS, I believe in the institution of the NHS, and I loved the work that I did there. But it was definitely time to move on for various reasons. I found it quite liberating. I think when I was working in the NHS, my work around trauma was not really appreciated. I don't think people were that interested in the organisation that I worked in. So it felt like I had a guilty secret. I was sneaking around doing conferences and delivering training and doing this work around trauma, and there was no real interest in what I was doing from my organisation. But I think that's my opinion.
It's a bit shocking to hear that, really, considering, David and I both tended to work mainly with people who would be, I guess, agnostic criteria for personality disorder, and so there's a lot of emphasis on trauma there. But obviously the roots of that are often in childhood, so you would think that child services would be very much set up to...
I think I should clarify, I think the clinical services that I was involved in, like the first episode psychosis service, they were very interested. We delivered lots of training around routine inquiry. We delivered training to the staff on therapeutic skills. So they were very interested. But I think at an organisational level is what I'm trying to say. At an organisational level, there was no kind of appetite to become a trauma or resilience-informed organisation, or to apply this to the organisation as a whole.
Okay.
So that's what I mean. But the clinical services that I worked in and was involved in, absolutely they were.
Yeah.
In fact, they were the people saying to me, "Oh, everyone we meet is affected by trauma. How do we ask people about this stuff? How do we respond if someone discloses? What kind of skills do we need to work effectively with people?" So they absolutely were, driving some of the developments that I work on today. But I think organisationally, I do a lot of work now, which is about helping organisations embrace this science of trauma and resilience, apply it to the workforce as well as the clients. So I don't think there was an appetite for that in any way.
Yeah.
So the drawbacks, I think sometimes when you're outside of the NHS, I think you are seen as an outsider. I think there's kind of like, you're somehow looked at with a little bit of like, they're not quite one of us anymore, But I always think that I do exactly what I did for the last sort of 30 years, which is draw on this understanding of trauma, stress, resilience, recovery, and apply it to organisations and settings where we're trying to help people. So I'm doing exactly what I did before, but just in a different context. And it's ironic because actually I go to a lot of like policy development meetings and stuff like that, and I'm the only one in the room not getting paid. Actually, everyone else is representing the NHS or social care or a university. They're all, they're all doing the day job. I'm the one giving up a day of my time, plus the train fares, plus everything else. So it's strange that once you're kind of seen as a commercial organisation, you're kind of not part of this institution called the NHS. I think there's a little bit of a mindset thing to get around, but I'd say most of the time not, because people recognise if you've got expertise and credentials and experience, and you can help them solve their problems, people want to work with you. And I always go on the basis of, I work with organisations and people on the basis of shared values and relationship. And if on that first meeting that's not apparent, then we probably don't have a second meeting. And that's the beauty of working outside of an institution.
Well, I was just going to come to ask you about that, because I think you were kind of like hinting at, but rubbing up against the NHS in terms of something that you're passionate about and could see a real need for, and perhaps not being able to do that within a big bureaucratic organisation. But are there any other advantages to working independently?
Yeah, loads, I think. I think it's the freedom to choose, really. It's a freedom to choose. I think you find the people that you share the same interests and values with, and you care about the same things. Ultimately, you don't have that choice when you work in the NHS. You don't, if you manage a set of services, they're there to serve the population. You do the job, you feed the beast, you satisfy the needs of this big machine called the NHS, and only a certain proportion of what you do is directly meeting the needs of the staff or the service users. A lot of what you do is meeting the needs of this huge machine. I didn't enjoy that part of it. Most of what I do today is directly meeting the needs of workforce, or the people caring for the people, or the actual recipients at the end. So I feel like a greater percentage of what I do is directly benefiting the people that I intend it to benefit. So for me, that is so much more motivating and so much more satisfying. Like, for example, last week, I met with two groups of senior leaders and pastoral staff from two schools in the trial that we're working on. So we're delivering these interventions into schools. And one of the things we're delivering is reflective practice groups, solution-focused reflective practice groups, in the interests of consolidating skills, unburdening processing, increasing sense of connection and validation, but also kind of in the interest of well-being. So I met with two schools last week, and they were so transformed by this experience of having these groups that we were providing for them. And they were saying, before we started doing this, we were exhausted, we were shouty, we were irritable, we were kind of at our wit's end. Now we've had this opportunity, we see things with more perspective, we've got more energy, we're more optimistic, we feel supported by each other, we know we're not on our own, and we love our job again. So that for me is kind of magical. I experience this on a regular basis, that people tell us that the thing that you provided, the thing that you gave to us, the thing that you've taught us to do is making a tangible difference to our working lives, either in terms of the skills that you've given or the knowledge or the well-being aspects of it. So for me, that's massively rewarding, because when I was in the NHS in my kind of last job, I was so many steps removed from the outcomes. So this is, it's definitely a privilege to be able to sort of witness that and to get that kind of feedback.
I think, as you say as well, the sort of more senior you get, the more removed you get from actually seeing the output at the end. And I felt very lucky in terms of still being able to do a lot of clinical practice as a senior psychologist, but increasingly you find yourself having to meet the needs of the bureaucracy, whether that be the NHS or two bureaucracies when we work in a prison.
Yeah.
You developed the REACH model. What is this, and is there any evidence this approach helps?
Yes, the REACH model stands for Routine Inquiry About Adversity in Childhood. So this came about by, basically out of my clinical work, I was working with people like Toni Morrison and Richard Bensall and John Reed, and they were all kind of advocates for this relationship between life events and outcomes. And we'd all in our clinical work seen that pretty much everybody we worked with had experienced trauma. So we were kind of all on the same page around the fact that part of our assessment should be, what happened to you? So psychiatry was all about what's wrong with this person. Let's give them a diagnosis and we can categorize them and then give them a treatment. We were kind of all about, well, let's understand someone's experience and let's look at the contribution of that to their condition or problem, their ailment or complaint. So it became pretty standard for us to kind of ask people about trauma as part of our assessment. And then when I was working in first episode psychosis services as like the lead consultant for psychological provision, we had about 6-7 psychologists or therapists, and we had like about 100 clinical staff. On one away day in particular, those clinical staff came to us and said, we totally on the same page. Everybody we see has experienced trauma, but we don't assess it routinely. We don't really know how to ask about it. And we don't really know how to respond if someone tells us. What do we do? Can you help us with that? So I said, yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll put together some training. We'll think about some good principles of what good looks like. We'll teach you how to ask, how to respond, how to hold that conversation in a predictable and therapeutic way, and then what to do next. So we basically developed that, delivered the training to 3 different teams, audited practice, learned a lot about what makes it stick and what gets in the way of it. And then it kind of, I think basically I kind of left the NHS, I left that service, and I'm not 100% sure kind of whether that was maintained or not. But what I do know is that work around inquiry carried on. So my kind of interests around how do we ask, how do we respond, how do we make that experience therapeutic, that's carried on. It's been a constant theme in my work. So we've kind of refined our approach. And basically in the last 15 years, we've had, I think, 8 independent academic evaluations of the REACH model. So now it's a 5-stage model, assess readiness in a team or organisation, preempt any obstacles, process workshop with the managers, get them all on the same page because they're going to be overseeing practice change and supporting their staff, deliver the training, which is a day, theory in the morning, skills in the afternoon, and then the next 6 months we support teams in terms of their consolidating their skills. So we do like a monthly consolidation meeting, supervision if it's you and I talking about it, but a consolidation meeting. And then we make ourselves available to the teams to be a source of advice and consultation. So we embed the practice that way. And the studies have said, the summary of the studies of our approach says it's feasible in lots of different settings, from health visiting to primary care. It's acceptable to staff and to service users. People don't complain when you ask them. Quite often they say, thank you, that makes sense, thanks for asking. And we find that people often don't, before you've asked, they often don't make the connection between what's happened to them and their current problems. So suddenly go, oh, okay, I never thought about it before, but actually, yeah, I started relying on drugs and alcohol when this happened in my life, or I started hearing voices when this thing occurred. But I never really tied the 2 things together. So I've been taking these tablets and, going to this service for 20 years, but actually no one's asked me about trauma. And maybe the solution is dealing with this trauma, this event, this series of things that happened to me, because this medication has not solved my problem. 20 years later, I'm still searching for a solution. I'm not getting any better. Maybe this is where the solution is. And it's the same in addiction. If people are still in pain, they continue to seek pain relief. But if you deal with the source of the pain, maybe they don't need so much of the pain relief. Maybe that's a part of the solution. So I think the same goes for the criminal justice system as well. We put people in prison. We don't rehabilitate them. We don't deal with the source of their pain, their distress, their social competence, their basic needs to function and live in society. We don't do it, not as much as we could. And we release them again, and people are still struggling with the same problems. So we treat the symptoms, which is the criminal behaviour, but we don't treat the cause. So that analogy just rolls on and on across all the different settings that we've worked in. But yeah, so the evidence is, if you ask people, they tend to tell you. And if they tell you, then start to make connections, and then they can get the right help. So that's the kind of nutshell evidence. The final thing is, if you ask parents about their experience, the studies of our work have suggested that parents then pretty reliably look at their own experience of being parented. So they go, oh, actually, I'm just doing the things that my parents did to my kids. And you know what? I don't really want to do that. That's not good enough. I want my kids to have a better experience than I had. So actually, is there any help that I can get? So they quite often go from, maybe if it's like a family support team, like, why is social services bothering us? Leave us alone. To, actually, do you know what? I don't know what good looks like. Maybe I could do with some help. And then we also teach health visitors to ask about adversity. Antenatal visits 6 weeks before birth. We get really positive responses from women. who say, thank you for asking. What a really important question to be asking a pregnant woman before you have a baby. Have I experienced childhood trauma and do I need any help? So there's a quick summary for you.
How easy do you find it to get parents to think about how they speak to their children? Because I think most people might be very conscious of the fact they don't want to hit their children if they experience physical abuse. But
Yeah.
I think so much harm's caused by the way people talk to their children, shout at their children, berate them. And that's less tangible to put your finger on, I think.
I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think as parents, we all make mistakes and we all do the best that we can. And my uncle Philip Larkin, said, they fuck you up, your mum and dad. They don't mean to, but they do, etc., etc. You might have to.
Oh, that's that you are actually related to Philip Larkin.
I'm not. Well, only in the sense that he was a librarian at Hull and I went to Hull. That's about all I know. But no, he's not really.
I thought, have I missed that?
I mean, who knows? But not as far as I'm aware. But that poem kind of sums it up, really. I think we don't mean to, but we often learn about parenting from our experiences of being parented. And sometimes that's good because we've had great parenting, and sometimes that's not so good. But the problem is we don't know that. We don't know what we don't know. So I think the conversations that the services that we train have with parents is a bit of an epiphany. And what one of my last trainee actually, who did a study with family support teams in local authority, found a very predictable pattern. Ask parents about their own adversity. They think about it. They then start to think about their own parenting. They become a bit upset about that. Then they realise they need some help. For 6 weeks after that conversation, they're very motivated to accept help. So for things like parenting interventions, where people can sometimes feel a little bit stigmatised, this is a brilliant solution. Give them this conversation, let them see this connection themselves, let them find that increase in motivation to do better, and then give them what they need, So, but yeah, I didn't answer your question about language directly, but I just think that increase in insight means you're going to think differently about how you speak to your kids, about how you treat them, because you inherently want better for your children than you experience yourself. So I'm hopeful that has an impact.
Thank you, Warren. Given all the evidence that you've just been referring to, really, why is it that routine inquiry about adverse childhood experiences isn't made, given everything we know about the effects and indeed the costs?
So why is it not standard practice?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think you've got to look at places like California. It is standard practice. If you go to a GP or a paediatrician, it's legislated in the state that you will be asked about adverse child experiences. It's part of a public health approach. They call it ACE screening, and then they will give you advice about resilience factors, ways of coping, ways of managing, and options. Basically, they'll educate you and then give you options. I'm not sure why it's not standard practice. I think if we had some legislation like in California, I think if professionals were incentivized to do this, like GPs in California are given a payment, I think they get like $27 or something every time they do an ACE screening, just like giving a flu jab or asking people about smoking, then it becomes part of a public health intervention and it's seen as an investor save thing. So I think if it was legislation, this was part of a public health approach, that GPs, addiction services, sexual health services got some kind of incentive, were inspected on this practice by, CQC, Ofsted or whatever. If there are incentives and if there were, incentives, I think is the right word. I think if there are incentives to do it, whether it's policy or whether it's scrutiny or both, I think that would really help. In the absence of that, what we've got is pockets of really good practice. So I've worked with Nottinghamshire Council for the last 5 years, their public health team, and their Director of Public Health, it was very clear in the kind of strategy document over the last 5 years, tackling adverse child experiences is one of our priorities because it drives so much poor health. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we do it is by asking people what happened to them and then giving them the right help. So we've been training services in Nottinghamshire, commissioned by Public Health, for the last 5 years, and we're currently at a point of training trainers within those services to sustain the approach for new starters and for staff that have, maybe need a refresher. So they've got this embedded in the whole county. And it was our approach was evaluated by Liverpool John Moores University, and they've just published a paper on it actually in terms of some of the key factors in being able to implement and create practice change. And so we've got pockets of really good practice, and there's lots of others. Blackpool Health Visitors are still doing this. We taught them how to do the REACH approach. Health Visitors in Redcar and Cleveland are doing amazing work. GPs in Birmingham. There's lots and lots of examples, but it really is the coalition of the willing at the moment. And I think for others, I think for others, there's quite often, I think it's an anxiety, if I'm honest. I think there's a reluctance because I think people are all super busy, often really, really at the edge of what they can cope with, doing two people's jobs in social care in the NHS, but, 145,000 vacancies in the NHS, 160 in social care, which means everyone's doing more than their job. So to then introduce this idea that I have to have a conversation that feels uncomfortable, and it might lead to some sort of safeguarding response, and it maybe feels a little bit scary because I'm not a therapist. All of those anxieties, I think, mitigate against people wanting to approach this. But what we know is if you give people training and you give them that confidence and the skills, they're quite happy to do it. And when they've done it a couple of times, they're like, yeah, this is just like another question that we ask people. Like in clinical practice, I would always say to people, here's a few things I'm going to ask you right at the beginning. One of them is about your mood. And I always ask two questions about your mood. One's about hopelessness and one's about suicide. Is that all right? Yeah, no problem. Okay. Next time we meet, hey, how are you doing? How was it since last time we met? Cool. Can I ask you about your mood? Right. What about hopelessness? What about suicidal thoughts? It's just a normal conversation. It becomes a standard conversation. There's nothing unusual about it. So, yeah, I think all of those things probably contribute.
But obviously driving these changes in practice forwards takes effort and consideration and, to some extent, I suppose, money. So, while you were talking, I was thinking it's a funny old world we live in where so much effort is going into promoting a bill to provide early death, and nothing is going into a similar law as they have in California.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I think we'll get there. I mean, we've almost got there a few times. There's about 3 times in the last 30 years this has almost become kind of policy at a national level. So we will get there again because obviously people are becoming more interested in trauma and trauma-informed approaches. So eventually the penny will drop that a part of that story is to ask people what happened to them instead of working out what's wrong with them. So we will get there. I think it's just kind of, it took 25 years before the adverse child experiences study was taken seriously, before it influenced policy and practice. So I think, we've come quite a long way actually in the scheme of things.
Thanks very much. So moving on, what are your thoughts about trauma-informed care?
I think it's a wonderful thing that people are now interested in the impact of trauma on people's lives. I think it's great that people are now interested in the thing called trauma-informed care. I still think it's a little bit misunderstood, and I think it's a term that I don't think is very well understood for a lot of people. And I think outside of clinical practice, the application of trauma theory to people's distress and problems is not massively well evidenced yet. So certainly if we're helping people who've got traumatization and conditions related to that, we know what to do. We know what kinds of interventions help, and we know what kinds of things don't help. I think we're also learning a lot about positive childhood experiences in terms of how they can mitigate against adverse childhood experiences. So that's amazing. We know that we can engineer some of those experiences into children's lives and protect them against some of the bad things that we might not be able to control. So that's amazing. But in terms of the other things like how do we best apply this approach in prisons? How do we best apply this approach in education? We've still got a lot of work to do. We've got lots of promising studies, individual studies, collections of studies, case series, etc. But we've got very few kind of gold standard studies. So that's why I think the Youth Endowment Fund and the Home Office funded these randomised controlled trials in schools. Whether or not an RCT is the perfect way of measuring something as complicated as a series of interventions that we're applying in schools is, debatable. I mean, it's certainly robust, But I guess what I'm saying is we need to evaluate what we're doing. We need to take seriously that process of building the evidence, because I think a lot of the time there's great work happening, lots of pockets of brilliant work happening in the country, but I don't often see really great studies coming out of it. I don't often see really great evaluations coming out of it.
Do you think we're sometimes making it more complex than it actually need to be? Because it strikes me that really the very basics is, service providers should be asking is, are we able to help enable people to feel safe when they're using our service, whether that be a school, prison environment, wherever. And actually, if you're not allowing people to feel safe in that service, then really, I don't think those services can very easily be described as trauma-informed. It often feels like a little bit of a badge that people wave around because they've had some knowledge and understand what traumas happen to people, but actually, as a service itself, surely, just if it boils down to safety as the very first step.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why our theory of change in the education, the trauma-informed interventions in schools, was really fundamentally around safety, creating a sense of safety, creating a sense of being able to access trusted adults. So we're all about relationships and safety. They were the two fundamentals that we said, these are two things that have to be present for this to be an effective environment for young people to develop emotionally, socially, and academically. That was the prerequisite. And if you think about schools' legal responsibility in loco parentis, basically means they're there to parent our kids when we're not there. And I would expect the minimum two things. One is safe adults and a relationship with safe adults, and secondly, that my child feels safe at school. So I completely agree that they are fundamentals, right? And then if on top of that, if you want to teach teachers how to help children regulate their nervous system and use breathing techniques and understand the way their kind of brain works and how they can flip the lid and lose control and how to regain control and all of those things, that's really relevant as well. That's really helpful too. And if we can teach non-violent communication, and we can teach good relational skills to teachers. We teach a program called Therapeutic Skills for people who work in education. So the idea was, what are the kind of skills that I learned when I was training that might be useful for a teacher or a health visitor or a GP who haven't had those kind of trainings? So what are those basic, or what I call generic therapeutic skills, like listening, like empathy, like validation, trying to resist the urge to fix something when actually what people really need is for you to hear them, So we equip teachers with some of these skills. And again, what do? Well, they establish a sense of safety. They enable a therapeutic relationship. So we're absolutely working towards those fundamental conditions for someone to flourish. But we've got to evaluate it, There's no point saying in my school people feel safer than they used to. If we're going to scale this up, if we're going to make this a kind of evidence-based approach like we did with CBT for psychosis or CBT for trauma, PTSD, whatever, we've got to get into the habit of measuring what we do. And I don't mean we have to do an RCT for everything, but what I mean is we have to somehow be able to prove or demonstrate that what we did was valuable, and that actually if we were to scale it up and share that knowledge and that approach, the potential for that to benefit other people in other places. So I think we have to get a bit better at doing that.
Thanks very much, Warren. I must say it's been a real treat talking with you today, and quite remarkable, really, given where we started this conversation, talking about your first school and leaving with, to be talking with somebody with such knowledge and experience and who's done so much in your field. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, that's very kind, thank you.
Having said all that, you have spent your life working with troubled families to support them and improve their emotional health. What do you do to protect your own?
What do I do to protect my own well-being? I think, I'll be completely honest with you, it's easy to talk about and it's easy to give a lecture on, stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. I spend my life teaching professionals about this stuff and encouraging them to look out for the early warning signs and to be proactive and to use reflective practice groups and to look after each other. So I know the theory, as good as anybody. Putting it into practice yourself is always a challenge. I know that I work too much. I know that I have extremely high standards, probably on the edge, on the verge of perfectionism, actually. So it's I know what my downfalls are. But what I do to sort of counteract that is I do therapy. So I do internal family systems therapy, which I find really helpful. Oh, it's one of many that I've tried, by the way, but this is where I'm at right now and I'm really liking it. I do martial arts. I've done karate since I was 16 and I'm 54 now. So that's a long time. I can't work it out, but it's a long time. So I do that. And I also run, cycle, lift weights and see friends, So I think social support is number one. And when we look at resilience and what helps people cope with stress, social support is the single most powerful factor. So if I was going to leave people with a message, it would be double down on your relationships. It's the best predictor of how long you'll live and how happy you're going to be. So relationships are the best medicine. I think is a good place to to leave it, I think.
Thanks very much indeed, Warren. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much, Warren, and we'll share a link to your website in our show notes, so if people want to get hold of you and connect with you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.